Good afternoon, everyone, or if you are watching from across the pond, good evening. I'm really excited to be back. It's been a while since we've done one of these, but hopefully you'll all forgive me. We are back now, though. And today I've got A.K. Larkwood with me. A.K. Larkwood studied English at St. John's College, Cambridge, and now lives in Oxford with her wife and a cat. The Unspoken Name is her debut novel, and you can find her online at www.aklarkwood.com and on Twitter as @aklarkwood. And actually, that is the book we're going to be talking about today. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Hello. No, it's very, very nice to be invited. Exciting to get to hear different human voices and see different human faces. Because we're just getting towards the end of the third national lockdown over here. So, very exciting to be able to be connected to other human beings and remember that they exist.
Yeah, I understand that one completely. I like to joke that the only people I know at this point are the people who come into the bookstore and the people who work at the bookstore and the people at the gas station. I have learned their first names. We have become friends. That's my life now. So yeah, anytime I get to do one of these and talk to another person, it's exciting. So
it is genuinely exciting.
Yeah. So first of all, let's start with your book. What was the initial spark that set you off on writing The Unspoken Name? And we sort of talked about it a little bit before.
Yeah. It's really hard to identify a single specific thing, but when we were chatting kind of before starting the event, we were talking about orcs and how kind of orcs and goblins are represented in fantasy, generally speaking. And one of the initial sparks was that in about 2015, over the summer, I decided I was going to reread all of the kind of Lord of the Rings ancillary texts. So I read Silmarillion for the first time and so on, and kind of it was very interesting following through this kind of fairly arcane elf lore and kind of seeing how the notion of the orcs as a people kind of evolved through Tolkien's creative process. And basically it's really interesting because he seemed to kind of wrestle with it over the course of his life, and kind of initially, there were various different kind of theories put forward in his work of why they existed, of kind of were they elves who'd been tortured or were they created as a purely evil people or whatever. And ultimately he wasn't able to really square it with his kind of Christian theological viewpoint, because he didn't really think it was possible ultimately, even though it was convenient for the story, for there to be a whole culture of people who were evil and had no souls. It just didn't work for him. And kind of I thought that was really fascinating, that even someone who is kind of seen as the progenitor of this trope of the orcs as the always evil people, actually thinking about what people are really like and how much difference and kind of different moral shades there are from person to person within any culture, it was impossible for him to square, really. And that kind of got me thinking about how I quite wanted to write a story from the perspective of a kind of tusked person. Also in the Silmarillion at the end, the kind of bad guy Versapen figure is locked away outside the mortal world forever. And I was kind of thinking about, it would be really tragic to be an orc or a goblin, and to know that you're kind of this godlike being who's been supposed to be your savior, who's been your leader all this time, is then locked away. And that very distantly became the spark for The Unspoken Name, because the Unspoken Name in the title is this mysterious god that's very kind of inaccessible and lives up in a mountain, and the people who are the followers of the Unspoken Name kind of do their best to worship that deity in as best they feel they can, and that ultimately ends up manifesting in the questionable practice of ritual child sacrifice, which is the origin story of the main character. So a long-winded way of coming around to explaining where that aspect of the book originally came from.
Sure. So let's, for what it's worth, my memory is really, really shaky because I haven't read the Silmarillion in 130 some odd years. But I thought that it was definitive that they were tortured elves. That was the background that he came up with.
Well.
Again, you read it more recently, so I'm going to defer to your wisdom on this. But
well, there are a few different sources, different letters and kind of writings and things. And I for about one summer about 5 years ago got really, really into it and knew the names of everyone and all the different sources and things. And I have to say, almost all of it has gone, so I may well be wrong. So if there's anyone who actually really does know this stuff, don't at me.
Oh yeah, you don't want to get the Tolkien scholars involved. That's a level that is a level of, and I say this as a nerd, that is a level of nerddom that I sort of look at with awe and terror. I'm like, no,
Yes.
that's a lot of effort you've devoted into that.
I respect and fear it.
Yeah, I feel appropriate. So speaking of respect and fear, let's talk a little bit about human, or in this case, orcish sacrifice.
Yeah.
So I guess one of my questions is how. So you built this world, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the orcs and sort of how you've envisioned them. But you built this world. How did we get from our god is locked away and unknowable, and we're not quite sure what to do? Like, to me, it would be baby steps. It'd be like, I don't know, like, let's try, like, having a feast day. It wouldn't be like, I don't know, let's take this child and kill it. So what was sort of the research that went into that? What was sort of the thought process behind it? It's a really unique choice, I think.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm not great at research generally. Like, I feel like this is the joke that I always make to people, that I love to write secretary world fantasy because I don't have to do any research and I can just make it up as I go along. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that I end up falling down a well with that. But so the notion that the main character, so for people who haven't read the book, the main character of the book, Sorway, is brought up as a child sacrifice, and she's kind of has this position of honor, but also when she's 14, she's going to have to climb up the mountain to the sacred cave where the god is thought to live, and that's going to be the end of her, and no one totally knows what's going to happen to her, but that's what she's got to do. And then she feels like she thinks she's okay with this, and then off she goes up the mountain, and then she can't go through with it, and she runs away with this wizard, and her life unfolds from there. What initially drew me to that trope was I wanted to write a story about a relationship between a kind of very charismatic employer and his kind of sidekick, because I'm really interested in exactly workplace relations, but kind of, I think that the kind of relationships that you have at your job are really interesting and complicated in some ways. Like, obviously, ideally, you would want it to run smoothly all the time, but I think it's almost like family relationships in a way, because it's quite hierarchical and you're with these people all the time and there's inevitably going to be some conflicts, but ultimately you're going to have to keep dealing with each other for the most part, so you kind of have to find a way to get along. So I kind of wanted to write something exploring that, and then I thought, why would this main character become committed to the charismatic wizard boss, even though he may not have her best interests at heart? And I thought, okay, so she feels she owes her life to him, and how has that come about? And then one of the other kind of big inspirations for it was a novel, The Tombs of Atuan by Ursula Le Guin, which is incredible. If you only want to read one book about someone who's been very tragically raised in a cult to be a kind of sacrifice, and ultimately reconsiders that position, definitely recommend that you read Tombs of Atuan first, and then you can read my book.
Fair.
And that's like it's a very beautiful novel, and it's all set at this kind of, or almost entirely set in this kind of temple complex with a kind of horrible catacomb labyrinth underneath it, and it's all about this young woman's kind of decision to break away from what she's always thought was going to be her destiny, and her kind of establishing her own identity. And part of how she establishes her own identity is that a very charismatic wizard turns up and kind of tells her about the world outside and how things can be different. And luckily in that book he's like a kind, sensitive, altruistic man, and in my book I wanted to, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this. Am I allowed to swear on this?
I mean, I'll tell you, yes. And in fact, it's one of those things where the videos are not marked for kids, and YouTube doesn't give me any money, so hell with it. Swear all you want.
Okay. Well, basically, if you think you might be offended, please look away now. Basically, the concept of that was, what if the charismatic wizard who turns up was not actually a kind and altruistic man, but was in fact a total fucker?
Excellent.
And that's where that came from.
Yeah. No, I love it. And that actually leads into another great question then, which is, writing about difficult power dynamics. I think that, societally, most of us are now looking at the world and realizing that a lot of the dynamics that our parents were raised on, or our grandparents are raised on, aren't necessarily the most healthy or exactly what we want. And we're starting to question a lot of those things. So here you've written a book where, as you put it, yeah, what if the altruistic person, the savior, isn't really a savior, but is actually a jackass and is really only out for themselves.
Yeah.
What? I guess how do you write that in a way? Because I'll be honest, in reading it, and again, I like to joke that these are all spoiler light, meaning I'm going to spoil some stuff because the truth is that you can't talk about a thing without spoiling it a little bit. I try not to have the big reveals, but in reading it, because I've read a lot of fantasy, fell into the same trope. I'm like, yep, nope, here's the hero wizard, and they're going to show him magic and teach them about the greater world. Cool. And then it starts very subtle. I think, like in the real world, how a lot of abuses of power, especially when it comes to someone who has helped someone else, whether it's an employer or it's a friend or it's a family figure, it starts very small, very reasonable requests. And before you know it, you're in a totally different place. How did you write that so convincingly?
Well, I think it's interesting, really interesting seeing people's responses to the character of the wizard, because I've been surprised by, it's always super interesting to see all reader responses, because it's very fun when there's a wide range, because it makes me think that I've done something that can be interpreted in a variety of ways, which is very fun. And I think that in some cases, Balthandros the wizard is not really read as a villain at all, because it's kind of almost such a normal thing in fantasy that the charismatic wizard guy is going to have like a 14-year-old apprentice that he's kind of more or less emotionally abusive to, kind of manipulative. Yeah. And I was kind of interested in that, and I've always been kind of interested in mentor relationships, the kind of the weirdness of kind of having to rely on this person, but also their interests are very opaque to you. It's kind of fascinating to me. And I've always been kind of interested in kind of the ways in which people can be convinced almost without realizing it to do something that's against their own interests, so that people kind of end up acting in ways that are like self-destructive or helping people who wish them ill, etc. And I think that's kind of interesting to write, because you get a very fun thing of writing this character who's very oblivious to the fact that they're going down a path which is not going to be good for them. And I feel like for the reader that can also be a fun experience, because you're like, oh no, but I completely understand why you're doing this, but also oh no. Like a very different example of this is in the Jade City books by Fonda Lee. They're incredible. They're these kind of martial arts / kind of gangland territory war stories. They're incredible. But in that, everyone in it has this kind of very complex, extremely beautifully rendered moral code where, they have to take certain actions, they have to take revenge for certain slights, and if you've done a certain thing wrong, that's the end for you, and so on. And so people will endlessly be doing things like, oh no, I guess I have to cut off my own ear now, and you as the reader are kind of like, oh my god, no, but also I completely understand why you feel you have to do this. So I've always think that's really fun in terms of trying to create a world in which the reader will completely understand why someone is doing this, while also being like, oh my god. And also on that kind of attempting that kind of realism of like an evoked mindset, I was also kind of interested in the perspective of the wizard on this, because he totally doesn't see that he's doing anything wrong. He's the most selfish person in the world, and basically, probably doesn't even register that it's manipulative. And it was kind of, I think maybe that's why it starts out kind of subtle, because he doesn't set out to be a bad person. It's just kind of, I can nudge people gently and they'll do what I want them to do, until ultimately he has total control over them. And I think that's kind of interesting to write. Yeah.
So I guess a follow-up question, and again, this is one of the reasons why this is so much fun for me, because I get to realize things that didn't occur to me before. Are you making an argument that the wizard is somewhat of a sympathetic character? Is this someone who didn't understand what they were doing?
Not really. He's terrible. He's one of my favourites to write, because it's this power fantasy of imagine if I was totally confident that whatever I was doing was the right thing, and nobody, he loves the sound of his own voice. All of his speeches are kind of very bombastic and so on. It's kind of like it's like, oh, this is me when I'm slightly drunk, thinking that all of my words are pure gold and so on, making these monologues. So a very fun character to write. I don't know about sympathetic. I wanted his motivations to be consistent and believable, but I don't have any sympathy for him myself, really. I think he's got himself into a situation of his own creation.
Yep. Oh no, 100%. Just the way you were phrasing it, I was like, actually that feels kind of, he wasn't trying, and then I'm like, no, hold on. Ends don't justify the means. That's how we end up with really awful things happening.
There's this thing with people who just kind of basically have that lack of empathy, where it's like maybe they don't set out to do harm, but there's a kind of reckless carelessness about other people's needs and rights, where it's kind of like, this could be malice or it could be simply not knowing, but it's not really excusable.
Completely. So, you mentioned something just there about sort of reflecting the real world, and I think fantasy reflects the real world spectacularly. And I actually think it's a great medium for trying to show people different problems, because it's very difficult. We all have our teams, whether it's a political affiliation or a religious affiliation, or I'm from Michigan, that's my affiliation, you're from Tennessee, that's it. We divide ourselves into groups, and it becomes really hard to see the other group's point of view or problem. Fantasy's great about this because none of us are elves, none of us are orcs, none of us live in this kingdom, none of us have, hopefully, this belief where we have to sacrifice children. And so as a result, you can bring things up without anyone's defenses getting triggered, and they're able to sort of see another point of view. And I think it's one of the beautiful things in fantasy. So I want to talk a little bit with that in mind about your vision for the orcs and how you created a very unique feeling orc, I guess, or orc race, orc people, orcs. Because it is really different, and I really enjoyed it. And like I said, I was talking with someone in the store today, and we were talking about how traditionally orcs, there's a lot of negative stereotyping. They're the monsters, they're the bad guys. At times you can even get weird racial stuff that kind of becomes a piece of it, and you did a really great job of turning all that on its head. So what was the design behind the orcs, I guess?
So it was kind of the culmination of a lot of things. I mean, firstly, that I've just always been very drawn to kind of the monsters or the side of the baddies or whatever. Like in all cartoons and things when I was little, I would always be like very keen on like the often the villain's sidekicks, which might be apparent if you read the book, but in all Disney movies, they'll be like the supervillain, and then they'll have like two little guys who help them with their evil plans. And I was always very like, I want to know more about that life. How's that working out for you? Why have you chosen this path? And kind of, I think we talked a little bit before this event about kind of watching the Lord of the Rings films and seeing these kind of like very like lovingly rendered kind of grotesque prosthetic makeups and things of the way the orcs are presented, and me being like, wow, this is incredible. I want to know more about their lives, like, because it's kind of like you'd see, this is a bit of a tangent about these movies, but you have the kind of like the legions of humans in their armies where they're all very kind of like symmetrical and uniform, and kind of they look nice and they look like the goodies, whereas when you have the crowds of the orcs and things, they're all very kind of wild and different. And I think I was very drawn to the kind of the chaotic aspect of that. So basically it was partly just, I think this is cool, and also partly because I just always find it really tiresome in fantasy where you'll have a whole culture whose entire purpose is to be evil, and it's kind of like, this is boring, and this is also not how people really are, because obviously culture is real, and different cultural values are a real thing. Like different things are important to different peoples, but I find it very hard to believe that you could have a group of people who would wake up every day and be like, yes, it's time for us as a society to be completely evil, because like, for one thing, how would that even stay together? So I kind of when I was thinking about the orc-like people in my book, I didn't want them to be kind of like all 100% evil, because that's ridiculous. And then I was also thinking about the kind of the like martial stereotypes, and like whether it might be interesting to write them to be like a very kind of, you know, almost like Romans or something, like very you know, interested in military dominance. And then I was kind of like, no, there's loads of fantasy about that, and I also find that boring, and I also don't know anything about military strategy, so that would be really hard. So I was kind of, I guess, the main kind of like transgressive element I was drawn to, I guess, is the fact that they have this, or the culture that we get to see has this god that has kind of very alien values attached to it. So it's kind of all about entropy and fading, and how everything declines into nothing, and their kind of, the child sacrifice thing is bound up with that. And it was all about kind of how they feel they have to bear witness to this entropy, and that the god is kind of not necessarily protecting them or doing anything good for them, but it is kind of a symbol of this decay almost, or this kind of cycle towards darkness and back out again in the world. I don't know. And so it's kind of interesting thinking about what kind of theology might grow up around that, what kind of, you know, reasonable thinking, feeling people might respond to that and try and build an institution around, and so on. So yeah, I mean, basically I didn't really have a defined kind of orc thesis that I wanted to put forward. It was those elements that kind of came together and created, I mean, what's basically like a monastery where they all have tusks. Yeah.
No, I think that's really cool. Like I said, it's really refreshing to read such a unique take on it. You know, because I think that because of how imprinted orcs are in sort of our collective minds about fantasy, it would be really natural and easy to make them like the Romans. They're interested in military dominance and conquest because orcs. And so the fact that you wrote something so different is, for me as a reader, really, really fun. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the relationships with the characters. There's a video that I really, really love. It's that Webb and Mitchell sound. They do a skit where it's two Nazis and they're talking, and one of them goes, you know, are we the baddies? And they start like breaking down all the, like, we wear skulls on our hats. Are we, like, I think we might be the bad guys. Like, no. I mean, maybe, but no. Your characters, you do a really great job of introducing someone, and not immediately, but immediately there's conflict with what is her name? Oh God. Main character's name. We were just...
Oh, Xoe.
Thank you. There's immediately conflict with her, and we're like, I don't like that person. And then as time goes on, you come to realize that people are a lot more complicated, and that everyone, from their point of view, has good reasons why they feel how they feel, why they're doing what they're doing. I mean, Arana maybe was... Yeah, is a great example of that. Like, from their point of view, no, this is a very different story about how they were abandoned. And it makes the moments where they kind of come together make a lot more sense. It felt very real, I guess. Because to your point, I've not met anyone who wakes up in the morning and says, today I will do evil for the sake of evil because I just love the sound of crying puppies in the morning. No one does that. They do things because they think they have a right to them. They think it's reasonable. They think the ends justify the means, whatever the case may be. And I saw that in all of the other characters, which I thought was a really cool touch. What was that by design? Was that something that happened as this nature of the story sort of took shape? And if so, how do you make that feel reasonable, I guess?
Was it by design? I don't know if it was really by design. I think it's kind of maybe more just an emergent property of how characters end up being when I've been writing about them for a while. Like, I find it quite difficult to write a character's, or to kind of... I'm not very good at planning ahead about what I'm doing, so I tend to just write a bunch of stuff and see what happens, which is not very efficient, but, you know. And I think with... Arana is a good example because in my first draft of the book back in 2015, she was just kind of nothing. Like, she was... she didn't have the cultural background that she did. She didn't really have a good reason to be doing anything that she was doing. It was just kind of, oh, I need a villain here to do some stuff. So she was just there, and her dialogue was just kind of moustache twirly, and she didn't really have a strong relationship with anyone else in the book. And then kind of as in subsequent drafts, I rewrote it over and over again, and kind of her relationships with the different people and her cultural context and her motivations for doing things and her like weird the joke that I've made to my friends is that she and Belthandros the wizard kind of they're similar in some ways in that they're kind of amoral and very ambitious, but the difference between them is that the wizard doesn't really have a moral compass, and she does have a moral compass, but it doesn't point north. It points in a very different direction. And so it's by kind of writing and rewriting and trying to discover what this character's motivations are and why they're doing stuff, and so to find out what they're going to do next so I can finish writing the goddamn story. They always just kind of end up feeling like they're in the right and they're doing the thing that they have to do, and so I'm kind of like, yeah, you know what, I guess everyone feels like this most of the time. So that's kind of how that happened. And then the other situation is kind of what you talked about with Xue and her rival Tal, who is this guy who turns up and they're the same age and they absolutely hate each other immediately, and they fight a lot and get in each other's way, and they betray each other in pretty awful ways and so on. And that they're kind of they're over the course of the book they kind of that relationship evolves. So I don't want to spoil too much, but kind of things stay exactly like that for them. And that was kind of that was the one where I did explicitly want to do a specific thing, which was I'm quite interested in the way that people in positions of power who abuse their power like to turn people beneath them against each other, because if you hate the other guy at work, then it's much harder for the two of you to get together and be like, wow, our boss really sucks and treats us badly, because all your attention is diverted to hating on this guy and hoping you might get some approval from above. And so I kind of wanted to look at that dynamic a bit. And also they have a dynamic that's kind of a almost sibling rivalry-ish, and I have 4 younger siblings, so that's kind of, I think, partly where some of their kind of fightiness came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's great, and I do appreciate the fact that their early part of their relationship is not. I feel like a lot of times there's the rivals thing where they're rivals, but like you can tell there's affection beneath it. No, that is not what felt with these two at all. So I think that was really well done. And then again, not to spoil it, but was as their relationship changes, it becomes really. I talked about with you with this with you earlier. You know where I'm going with it. It's great. So let's talk a little bit about relationships. So I want to talk about representation, because sort of like we were talking about before, while I love the fantasy genre, it has been described to me by people who don't as old white men write about heroes who are farmers and have swords. And it sometimes has felt hard to argue that that's not entirely true. And as more authors come to the table with different points of view, wanting to tell different kinds of stories, I think that becomes an image of the past and not so much the present. But first of all, I guess the first question is, how important is it to you that we have representation in the fantasy genre?
I mean, well, very important. I guess, for me, kind of, I wanted to write a story with more queer representation because, like you say, that was something that I was not seeing at all and really wanted. And I think, like, in the years since I first wrote the first draft, kind of getting on to 6 years ago now, things have really changed, and I'm seeing a lot more kind of all different kinds of queer representation in sci-fi and fantasy. So that's really great. I really enjoy it. Very nice to get to read, not stories which not only reflect my experiences, but kind of, the experiences of my friends and family and, who have a kind of different experience than I've had. So that's very nice. I don't know if I would say I really wrote the book to set out to kind of be like, representation is good in itself, and I would like to contribute more of that to the sort of sum total. Well, that was kind of, that was not there, but it was more just kind of like, I want to write this kind of story about a heroine who it's not like me at all in many ways, but kind of who I can relate to in that way where I haven't necessarily read something like that before. But it was also kind of a weird experience because, like at the time of writing it, kind of. Well, but it's always difficult because if in the genre there aren't a lot of models of how you write a queer relationship or what have you, it's kind of difficult to know where to source stuff from. Because if you're writing about a straight couple, it's kind of like, yeah, you have the whole of literature to draw examples from. Like, you know, there aren't that many works of fiction that don't have some kind of romantic relationship between a man and a woman in. So there's lots of kind of stuff that you can draw on and bounce off and reflect on and kind of be like, I don't want to do this, but I do want to do that because I like this and I didn't like that. And some of that translates, but some of it doesn't translate so well. And so writing a relationship with two women, it's kind of like, I just don't have that many examples to go from. And with the ones that I do have, I don't want to seem like I'm copying those or doing exactly the same thing as those. And then it's also kind of like, well, I could draw some stuff from my own life, but that feels really personal. And then I feel like if I write it into the book, people will know. And I don't want that. Like, I didn't become a writer so I could say people could know about me. So it's kind of a weirder experience. It requires a bit more, what's the word? A bit more thought. It's hard to do on autopilot. So that was kind of an interesting challenge, but, you know, the more people are doing this, the more kind of most reference material that people will have coming up. So, you know, what's the good?
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And also, I think that, you know, it's been really refreshing to not have, I'm sure there's a proper term for it. I'm not a writer, so I don't know what it is. But I call it like the special episode feel when it comes to a book about inclusiveness. So, for example, I'm Jewish. I love whenever there's books with Judaism in it or with Jewish characters. But I have found over the years that like 90-ish% of books where Judaism is a thing, it's the Holocaust, and I get it. But it's like 5,000 years of history. Pick any other point. I don't want to read any more about that. And so I can only imagine what it's got to feel like when they're like, you know, when there's a book, a character in a book or a character in a movie or a TV show, and they go, look, they're gay, and we're going to explore that they're gay, and that's what they're about. It's just them being gay. There you go. That's got to feel really frustrating. And so what I also appreciate is that it isn't, not to say it isn't an issue in your book, but it's not. There's no like I said, there's no special episode moment where like they have to explain that sometimes, you know, women love women and men love men and men love women and men, and they just, nope, that's a thing, and we're not going to even like, I mean, we're going to address it, but we're not going to address it. So was that also a conscious choice, or was that just a natural outgrowth of the writing?
No, that was 100% a conscious choice, and one that came a little late, honestly, because I feel you're totally right. Like, I feel like it was very common when I was reading the small number of sci-fi fantasy books I've been able to find that did have queer characters in. It was very often like, you know, especially in fantasy, because it had a kind of quasi-historical feeling. It would be kind of like, oh no, this love is forbidden, or oh no, what are these? I have a lot of self-hatred about these illegal feelings I'm having, and so on. And that's kind of super not my experience at all. So I would kind of be trying to write stuff where it was kind of like, oh no, the king is forbidden, and just kind of being like, but this is just. I feel like I have to do this because this is the only model that I have, but also I don't really have anything to go on here, and I don't find it particularly interesting, but I guess this is the story that I'm allowed to tell. And so when in early drafts of the book, there was kind of the Unspoken Name, there was kind of weird like background homophobia and kind of and I sort of felt like that was the way things had to be. And then actually it was after we sold the book, and my amazing editor was kind of like you know, you don't have to, you know, like all the background guards don't have to be men and so on. And kind of thinking about actually, maybe I don't have to write this book with a kind of weird, vaguely historical-ish feeling of kind of historical prejudices. Mm-hmm. And that also kind of gave rise to more interesting storytelling decisions. So, for instance, in the book, there's if you haven't read it, the romantic subplot involves kind of the main character and her love interest, who's a young woman, escaping from the love interest's tyrannical aunt, who's extremely evil. Mm-hmm. And when I was originally writing it, I kept writing the aunt character being like, they've run away together, but I can't think why, and kind of not being able to understand that, and so her kind of pursuit of them was not very motivated, because it was kind of like, oh, two young girls run away together, I'm sure that's fine, and they're not doing anything bad. And so actually kind of making it more possible within the evil aunt's worldview that actually, oh, maybe they're in love and they've run away together, and maybe they're escaping from my control, and that would be really bad. Kind of made it much easier to intensify the kind of pace and stakes in those sections, because I could have the aunt be very like, oh no, they might have run away together and that's really bad and I must hurry after them, sort of thing. So yeah, it's kind of it's interesting, because trying to write a world that doesn't have those kind of prejudices, it does close off a few storytelling avenues, because, you know, if you're having a world which is very inclusive of people of all sexualities, it becomes more difficult to write stories about kind of like, oh no, I, the noble woman, am being forced to be married with an evil man and I hate it, which I don't feel like I ever want to read again anyway. But it opens up other options if those things are known in society. Like, if it's just not an issue, you can do other stuff, which is quite fun. And also, yeah, really wanted to avoid the very special episode feeling, because I feel like when you run across that, it transforms something that could be for you as a marginalised person of whatever identity, something that could be like, oh, I feel like I'm, you know, you have the opportunity to get whatever you get from a book, like that feeling of knowing yourself a little better or thinking about something in a different way, and it kind of transforms it from that into, oh, this is trying to explain what I am to somebody else, to the outside, and I can't get anything from this because it's still not for me, even though theoretically it's about me, which is, yeah, like you said, super exhausting.
No, that's a really great way to put it. I've never really thought about it before, but I think you're completely right. Every time that I've read one, I'm like, yep, nope, you're trying to explain this experience to someone else. This is still not for me. I just would like something for me. That's, wow, okay, very cool. So my penultimate question is, again, sort of that trope of old white men writing books about farm boy heroes. Why is it that you think that we still see women fantasy authors and main characters so underrepresented in the genre? As you pointed out, it's definitely shifted. I think it's shifted over the last 5-6 years, but it still feels like that is not the, you know, roughly 50% of the population, and therefore 50% of the works being put out. Why do you think that's the case with this genre?
I mean, I don't really know, to be honest, because I don't think it's the case that women aren't writing this stuff, because, like, you know, I've always had, like, love to have a writing group and kind of chat about storytelling with my friends and things, and I think that there is a lot of interest in speculative fiction with people of all genders, but I wonder if it's kind of, if it's partly self-sustaining, kind of the sense that, oh, writing like epic secondary world fantasy is something for boys who, you know, whatever gender stereotype, kind of, you know, love to write about like Warhammer formations. I mean, I will say I was super into Warhammer, so this is...
I miss fantasy battles quite a lot. I not to play Age of Sigmar, I get it.
Yeah. I just used to like reading the army books.
Oh, yeah.
Not even a stereotype that really holds true, but I feel like, in a way, if you kind of think, oh, this isn't really for me, like, there's not much point even trying to break into it, it can be kind of off-putting. And also, I think that kind of maybe that dual worry about not being taken seriously as a writer, I feel like that kind of hits especially hard if you're a woman or a marginalised person of any kind, really, because it's kind of like... sci-fi and fantasy as a genre is sometimes not taken super seriously. It's kind of seen as being like fluffy escapism or not really serious or whatever. And then also, if you're a marginalised person, there's also the feeling of maybe my work won't be taken seriously, maybe there will be no audience for this. And it's kind of, maybe you think it's safer to go with a genre which you feel will be more respectable or more commercially viable or whatever. I don't know, that's just kind of a theory, but like, yeah, like you say, like, things are getting a lot better, and I feel like there's a lot of really good, like, a lot of support and really good community out there. So kind of, if people like I you know, even me, not really a big cheese at all, people have occasionally written to me and said, oh, you know, I'm a person of such and such marginalized identity, and I've written this fantasy book that reflects my experiences. But to be honest, I'm thinking about self-publishing because I don't think there's much chance of it being accepted in mainstream publishing or whatever. I think it's not worth it's not worth stopping yourself before someone else can stop you, because actually I think there's more scope than it sometimes seems like, and lots of people are very keen to kind of branch out and have more voices heard and so on. So my fingers are crossed that things will get better over time.
And I think they absolutely will. And for what it's worth, in the future or now, if anyone's watching and they're thinking about writing a book that sort of talks about their experiences and it's a fantasy and they don't know how it'll work, go submit it, try and get it published. Because I will tell you, as someone who spends their days selling fantasy books, which is pretty great when I say it out loud like that, it is the most fun in the world to be able to find people different and unique books. I don't need to hand sell Tolkien. Everyone knows what that is. I don't need to hand sell any of those kinds of stories. Write your story. Write something different. I think I'm representative of a lot of fantasy readers. We are super excited about good stories. I don't care. Just give me your awesome story. Which ties in, I think, kind of neatly to the final question I've got for you today. I can't help but notice that when I go and I look at Goodreads, I see there's a little parentheses and like a series name and a 1. That implies to me there might be another book. So if it's not going to get you in too much trouble, is there another book coming? Are we working on something else?
There is definitely another book coming. As with all things, this year past has been kind of weird for me. So that's kind of impacted the writing of it a little bit. But it is getting towards being done, I would say, as in getting towards being ready to go rather than getting towards a first draft being done, in which case that would be more of a problem. I've had a lot of fun working on it. I'm not sure how much I'm supposed to say about it, but it's a direct sequel to the first book, and it follows most of the same characters. I think almost every character who's alive at the end of the first book kind of gets a look in a little bit. It's set a couple of years later than the first book and kind of follows some of the continuing adventures. And it was very interesting and in some ways difficult to kind of return to writing these characters for the first time, where I started writing them for the first time when I was 24 and now I'm 30, and kind of things have changed a lot. So like when I wrote the first book, which is about a kind of developing relationship almost, I was friends with the person I married, but we weren't even dating yet, whereas now we are extremely married, and so that's kind of writing about an established relationship kind of both felt appropriate and like something I hadn't really done before. So that was kind of interesting, and one of the things that I wanted to explore with it was the kind of the weird feeling of almost kind of melancholy feeling of when you commit yourself to someone, you're kind of like, oh, I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. It kind of very much brings home to you the fact that like the rest of your life is going to be a definable period of time. Like you're not going to be just you on your own forever. You're committed to both your own mortality and someone else's. So it's kind of a tiny bit scary in a way. So I sort of wanted to deal with that feeling a little bit in this book.
Mm-hmm. No, that's awesome. I am looking forward to reading it. So, quick shameless plug, and then I'll let everyone go. If you enjoyed this and you went, gee, I would love to read this book, you can absolutely get a copy at Town Book Center. We are located in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, right across the street from, I think it's the country's largest Wegmans. So, yeah, you can find us. We're there. If you're not in Pennsylvania or you just don't feel safe going out and about, that's completely fine. You can always order from us online at www.townbc.com. That's TOWN as in Nike, E as in Echo, B as in Bravo, C as in Charlie.com. And yeah, thank you again so much for doing this with me today. This was a lot of fun, and it's always fun when I get to talk with people about fantasy. I have a slight bias.
Oh, well, it's been really great talking to you as well, and thank you for asking such kind of interesting and insightful questions. It's been really great.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks again to everyone for tuning in today, and have a great rest of your day, and stay safe out there.